Thank you, everybody, for wonderful presentations. I just want to welcome everybody again. Thank you for joining us today on this really beautiful afternoon. My name is Nadine Khoury. I'm an assistant curator here at the Jameel Arts Center, and I've been working with Sunoj and Namrata on their project, Desert is a Forest. So we're going to have a discussion for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the audience for a Q&A as well. So I'm going to start with plants, just because of my recent obsession with plants. So plants are quite amazing in the sense that they're a bit alien if you compare them to humans. They have the ability to do things that we can't. They're static, so they have to find solutions to survive in different environments, and this is how they've evolved over time. And from a deep time kind of perspective, desert plants are really fascinating in that sense. You mentioned one of them, Shahina. A popular example in the UAE is the ghaf. The roots can go down to 30 meters below ground to tap into the water. But not only does it do that, it also provides shelter, medicine, food, not only to humans, but also to non-humans. And I think this is the kind of entanglement that you look at in your work. And I guess I had a question for everybody. And what is at stake when we lose these ecosystems and we destroy these natural environments? Sunoj and Namrata, if you can comment in terms of your understanding of the domestication of politics of domestication, and maybe Shahina from a conservation perspective as well.
Well, I mean, I have no problems with domestication. I mean, when you look at domestication of plants, it is necessary. It is absolutely necessary for livelihood. I mean, as possibly you know that we in the whole world depend upon, I think, 4 different plants, rice, this 4 sort of cereals, and they were all domesticated a long, long time ago. What I am looking at and what I do not or would not like to lose is the plants that are used for horticultural purposes. They come out, I mean, they have value. Yes, they're very beautiful plants. I mean, yes, they will look lovely, but I would rather be advancing the use of your local plants so that we do not bring more and more plants that are growing elsewhere into a country. Because once you start doing that, you again, coming back to culture, coming back to your indigenous values in a way, you start losing them. You start losing them altogether. You can grow very lovely plants. I mean, I can see them, many of them growing over here, but they don't have the same value, let's put it this way. So,
well, domestication of plants from the perspective of with a perspective of human intervention in the landscape, I think this domestication is closely related to food security. And this food security question has always been a entangling factor. Now, when domestication happens, there is a conscious selection of a particular plant, whether it is now, whether it is in history. There's a conscious selection of a particular plant to multiply. Now, I'm confused. Is that is it a departure from entanglement and to create a different structure? So what do you think?
Yeah, I think there is a new kind of a biodiversity you're creating when you multiple one grain for huge area, because it's a grass which is bringing seeds to you, and when it's become a large area, like we see many plants when we are grazing after the harvest. When the rice it's a rice land where we graze. When the rice is there, we don't see any other plant because it's another thing is intense chemical farming, and it's all small farmers, and it's a survival.
Sorry. So there's in domestication, what happens, especially with a conscious selection of plants, we forget all the other non-humans who are maybe not dependent on that particular plant. So what is our role in that? So
That's why we were asking that question, like, because when we look at food security, we were looking only human-centric.
Yes.
And that's why we felt we are not farmers. Because we are looking at a interconnectivity, like, because we did with our baggage, we grew 200 bananas in the land. Because we said, we sell banana, economic sustainability, that is. And then bananas came. And no banana we can cut because we also bad skilled farmers. We couldn't cut the banana until a bird come and peck, because that's when we know it's ripe. The green color is not changed, but still bird will know tomorrow it will be yellow, and today that bird will eat at least 2-3 bananas.
Yes, and at the same time, this plant, that's when again we go back to entanglement, because it's so, I feel, the most important thing to look at the landscape is that same banana is being observed maybe by 30
So many
types
people.
of creatures. And
We also.
And
We
we
go every
also.
day.
So every day we observe, okay, today it's not yet yellow, tomorrow it will be yellow, and tomorrow we can sell the banana. Okay, but then if that whole patch is cropped off, is cut off,
Yeah.
what happens to all, maybe, I don't know, 100 types of creatures waiting for the banana to ripe, So what happens then? So what is food security? Whose food security are we talking about? So if they do not get what they're looking for, the next thing is they come and enter our kitchen, which has happened to our home also at one point of time. So yeah, I mean, we really don't have a clear, it's like, it's a lot of things going on, yeah.
I mean, in terms of the research, when we were researching the different plants, we were looking at different communities and trying to learn from them what this entanglement means. And this is what I found really fascinating in Shahina's book, right? Because, I mean, you're a botanist, taxonomist, but at the same time, you also do ethnobotanical work. So you also look at oral histories, vernacular knowledge, names of plants, etc., which you also record in your book. And I was wondering if you can elaborate on the different methodologies which you employ to do this work with different communities, and then what ends up making it to the literature, and then what's left out in a way.
Well, it's not a small process, let's put it this way. It's a long process, because I think one of the things that you have to do is to be out in the field. It's a very important aspect for any artist. You have to be hands-on. You cannot do anything sitting in your laboratory or sitting in there. And especially for botanists, we have to be out in the field. So I've got hours and hours and hours of collections where you're actually there out. And it's only when you look at a plant you are able to identify it properly. Some plants are tall, some plants are small, some grow this way, some grow that way. The habit of a plant is very important. And if there is anybody around, I mean, that was at least my way of noting down vernacular names. You ask them, what is this plant? And especially people who lead a nomadic life, whose animals depend on those plants and who use those plants, especially those. You ask them, you ask what their value is, they will tell you, and you record it. In the central part of Oman is a language which is not spoken, it's Harsusi. It's a very few people who understand it. Only about 200 or 300 households are there. And when I was working over there, I thought, well, this is a language which is probably will die very soon, or at least it will never be taught in schools. It is not. Arabic is something that is prevalent. Everybody knows that. So I started to record these plants by getting he was a tracker, he would track the oryx in the deserts. So I said, well, you come and sit with me, and you just say it in your own language, in Harsusi, and I will record it in Arabic. So how far they are correct, how far they're not correct, but the sound that, even the sound of that, so that was. And I had a group of students from the Oman Botanic Garden. This is quite a recent thing. They went into the central desert to collect these plants, and sure enough, they used, my book, and they were able to say it I had written it in Arabic and in English as well, and sort of transliterated it. And people did understand it, so I was very happy that it wasn't all wrong. But I'm sure there are lots of errors in it as well. But this is the only way. You have to be there. When you collect the plant, you have to get all the data that is associated, like is it growing on a rocky place, in the gravel, in the sand, near the water, not near the water, and then record it back.
Yeah.
As I'm not too sure what's happening.
No, we have 20 minutes left. Yeah.
So when you bring back the plants, I mean, I'm just sort of going on from there. They are treated so that they don't. They're dried really well so that they're not they don't attract insects.
Yes.
So you have to distangle them from the rest in a way, and they're then labeled properly as to where they come from, what was their habitat like, and stored. And where I work in Kew, at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, we have plants dating back to the 1800s, so at least a couple of 100 years old plants we have. And once an area has been collected enough, like, I mean, you think you have collected each part of the area, then only you're able to write a flora. You're only then able to describe all the indigenous plants of that particular country. So I'll just give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
The collections, I'm now associated with the flora of Iraq, which I'm writing. But before that, I've written the flora of Oman, just a small country, and visited every little part of Oman, collected the plants together with other collectors who have collected them as well. And then it took me 15 years just to write or start with the first volume. And of course, then the volumes once they were done. But it takes quite a long time before you are able to say, okay, I think I've got enough data, and then I can write it. The flora of Iraq, the collections started in the 1920s by various people who would go. They were, all sorts. Some were doctors, some were non-doctors, some were just interested botanists, travelers. They collected and they were stored in Kew, a lot of them in Kew, a lot of them in Baghdad itself, in various parts of the world, major herbaria. And it took more than 100 years, I think. So in 1965, the first volume of the Flora of Iraq it was published. And it was slowly being done over a period of time. Then, of course, there was a change of political situation in Iraq. It all stopped. And I took over it only in 2010 or 2011, using the same plants which were being stored in the cupboards of Kew Gardens and elsewhere, looking at them again and finishing it. It's not yet complete. I have one more volume to go through before the flora is complete. So it's a long process. And they say taxonomists live the longest because they feel they have to complete the flora of a particular region. So, I mean, sometimes it can take over 100 years, over several taxonomists taking over from one to the other to get to know. But then again, once the flora is written, that is the baseline information for everything to build on, from conservation to horticulture to looking at food security, the plants that are eaten, if the recorded data is good. So it's a baseline information is important.
So if we take the Kew Botanic Garden as a kind of case study, let's say, or an example, a lot of botanical gardens, they've made strides in conservation, preservation, but they also played a part in stripping some parts of the world from their biodiversity and resources. So today, what is the kind of future of these botanical collections, and what are these institutions doing to kind of...
Yeah, well, there came a period, I mean, the major botanic gardens, let's me put it this way, like Berlin, Vienna, Paris, Kew, Leningrad, or St. Petersburg, these are very major herbaria which were, let me put it so, the rulers of the previous world, of say 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And through their colonization. They were able to collect plants in all the places which they colonized. And that is why Berlin has got extremely good collections of the plants that they had. Britain, for example, was big empire in India and Pakistan, what is now a large part of Africa, East Africa and West Africa. So most of the collections are African and Indian, which I think perhaps even India doesn't have it. I know that India is writing their own flora, but it is not yet complete. So these are quite important collections for Kew Gardens as well, but equally very important for the countries where they came from, because botanists obviously in those countries want to write their floras. Exactly. And the conditions have changed, the environment has changed. Plants are perhaps not present there anymore. So what Kew Gardens, of course, does, or there's a very big project, or what is called digitisation of plants. So these plants are now, they're all on standardized paper, they are stuck on that, they're like dried herbarium material, what we call herbariums, and they are being scanned with and using their label data, the data which is there on their habit, when it was collected, by whom it was collected, is now being repatriated, in fact, to the world. So there are websites now which you can pick up, and you will get all the information of the collections that have been done over along the past 100 years, together with, Kew Gardens holds a total of about 7 or 7.5 million sheets, which have to go through digitisation. And this program has just started, and the government of Britain is behind it, of course, and we've got the funds to do that. So this will take another 10 years or so. But it will be done, and that material is then available to anybody who wants to study it, rather than coming to Kew. Kew is a public organization, so you can always come to Kew and look at the material, but it's not always easy. Still, Iranians can't come over. There's political reasons and all that. So, but once it is available, you can hook on to the databases that are publicly available and look at all the information. And one of the main uses, I think, in countries, for example, like the UAE, I would say, is because the development is so fast over here. The information is being lost so quickly and so fast that it is almost frightening. Some of the old collections, so when we go to look at a particular plant, you always go and look at the old collections that are there and say, okay, well, this plant comes from this particular locality, it flowers in February. And whoever that is going there, they will go at that time and try to go to that locality to be able to collect it again. Many times it's not there. Many times you can't find it. So it's very important to have that information available to the people whose land it is, really, in a way.
Yeah. I think we're going to take a few questions from the audience. Yes, Nadia.
Thank you for the super interesting talks. My question is to Shahina. I hope it makes sense. There seems to be this tension between change and documentation, right? Like, because even in some of the things you presented, like these plants, they're mobile, right? And we don't know where things actually originated from and how long they've been there for. And at the same time, documentation and preservation are about trying to somehow impose some kind of stasis, right? To record something in a particular state. So I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about how you kind of grapple with that. And while I recognize it's super important to preserve things that are very quickly disappearing because the nature and the pace of change right now is very different than other forms of change, there's been a lot of pushback generally around preservation, conservation, and some of the politics around that. So I was wondering if you could talk about that in relation to your work.
Well, as an answer to your first question, I mean, it is, yes, things have moved around, and things for many times you just do not know where they come from. Of course, I mean, that's very clear. I always think that documentation at any time is very important to be able to in a way, in a way, know at that time as to what was there, because that information is going to help. It will always help you. It will always help you afterwards. One of the examples that I can take is that documentation of plants, for example, in England, has been done since a very long time, because English people are very keen naturalists, and they've been documenting the flowering time of plants. So this particular, whatever it is, scarlet pimpernel or whatever, flowers in July. It always flowers in July. And they have been recording that in their notebooks, in the floras. And suddenly now we have been looking back onto it and finding that the flowering is starting much earlier. And you can relate it to global warming. I mean, that is something that you can relate it to. Plants that have disappeared from certain areas, why is that? Is it a change of climate? Or is it because goats have eaten it, for example? Yeah. Or because there have been some development or something like that? So documentation is always important at a particular time. And I can't stress it less that yes, it may not be correct at that time, but people coming later, just as we have come much later from those who've documented the plants, like in cuneiform texts on clay tablets, or the Greeks have done, or the Egyptians have done, we learn from them where they started. One of the good things that science has done is they've started to look at molecular work now, to look at the DNA, which is only about 20 or 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, when we started to look at the genome, at the actual chromosomes, and what they say about the plants. And through that, we have been able, or molecular scientists have been able to find the origin of plants. So things like cucumber, for example, something very straightforward. Where did cucumber come from? Finally, going back to the areas which looked like cucumbers, totally inedible, you can look at the chromosomes and compare the similarity of those chromosomes. Some of the genes, as you know, carry on from one generation to. So that is how the origin of the plants can be maintained or can be found. And that also is very important, because that simply gives you, in a way, a route, why they came and how they came. So that is all anthropological or archaeobotanical. But it also gives you the wild genes, the actual genes. We know then that this was the plant. It may be, inedible, but what has come out of it is an edible plant. Now, if tomorrow there is some disease which kills all the cucumbers in the world, we still have the original, or we know where the original cucumber was, and can then process it again to something edible. So finding what is known as crop wild relatives, that is also a very big science now, to find all the wild relatives of the crops that are now domesticated. Everything from papayas to all the fruits and the vegetables. So that is also, and that is a science which is now very well developed. Just to say that it has been done for the UAE as well, and for Oman. And there's something like almost 128 plants just in the UAE which can be associated with crop plants, many of them belonging to the pea family. So they are far relatives where the genes can be used to improve some of the varieties of peas. I mean, these are things like peas which can grow in saline waters, peas or other legumes which can grow in sandy deserts, in hot climates. So that is quite an important aspect of. Yeah.
We can take another question or two. Ajmal and yeah.
Hello. This is also. Can you hear me? A question for Ms. Ghazanfar is how extensive is also, once you're recording all the plants, the actual saving of the seeds? And does that happen alongside, or is that a whole separate operation?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
about saving the seeds of the plants that are being recorded in the region, does that go alongside also recording all the plants, or is that a completely separate endeavor?
No, not separate at all. Not separate at all. And there's a great endeavor again to be able to conserve the germplasm, as they say, the seeds. Yes, and then there is a program, I think more or less right through the world now, to collect the seeds of plants. But once they collect the seeds, you are really required to collect the actual plant as well as a herbarium material, as a herbarium specimen, so that you know that this is the plant and this is the seed which is associated with that. Yeah. So that is quite important. Otherwise, seeds all look the same. Many of the plants, seeds look very similar. So that's very important. Yeah.
Thank you.
My name is Ajmal, and pleasure to meet you again, Shahina, and Namrata and Sunoj. Thank you for the very interesting talk. I'm talking in terms of documentation, as you rightly mentioned, which is the key to highlight species, to promote species, and so on and so forth. But what I love about today is seeing the couple here from my next door state of Kerala, and yourself as a hardcore botanist. You guys are talking about conservation from a different perspective. You're talking about animal husbandry. You're talking about how plants relate to nature and to common men and women, of course. And then you're talking about the value of plants and how important it is to protect them and to save them and conserve them and so on and so forth. So I'd like to ask all three of you this question: How does conservation relate to in many ways spirituality and art? How do you think are they related, and can they work in sync towards protecting a species?
It's a very big question. Well, conservation is something I think Shahina will be fantastic in elucidating in much bigger detail. But when you bring about the topic of, you mentioned role of art in conservation, you mentioned, well? I think it's also a perspective.
Yeah.
Perspective of art per se, big to begin with, So can conservation be an act of art, or can being with, let's say, grazing be an act of art? So there is a fair bit of conservation happening in different methodologies. I would say that. I think it's a matter of perspective.
Yeah, how you look at it, into it, because it's also we talk about grazing, and the UAE have a big problem of grazing, because a lot of gaf trees are eaten by camels. That's why they ban grazing. Or sheep farmers.
But the history of this region is almost 20,000 years of pastoral nomadism. What happened to that history? Like the earliest remains of goat and human settlement was found somewhere in Iran. Then it was found later in Syria and some parts of Fujairah. So there's such a long history of this journey. So the transformation is again a different conversation altogether. But then, so the grazing aspect, or let's say conservation on the other hand, is quite conflicting, in contemporary times. One side you're trying to ban, and one side you want to also conserve something. So, yeah.
It's a very difficult question. Trust Ajmal to ask such a question. Yes, it is. It's not easy. It's not easy to combine conservation and sort of what you call grazing. These lands have been transformed.
Exactly.
Over a period of time, and sometimes I say, who are we to stop it? But having said that, there is something called controlled grazing, perhaps, and management or managed grazing. If we are able to do that, I think perhaps that should be followed. Yeah. It's
because now UAE goats eat alfalfa grass from Brazil.
Yes.
That's their food.
And they're
know.
not allowed to eat
They're not allowed to eat their
the
favorite ones from
plants.
local.
A lot of the plants' memory also comes from grazing. You know, like the people who are talking about these plants, they also say about the change of season and the change of grazing patterns. And they are so interconnected, these plants, this traditional way of living, being, you know.
But the plants have also, I mean, can we continue?
Actually, we're out of time.
Okay.
But thank you, everybody, again. We're going to be taking a 20-minute break. Please do help yourselves to some coffee, tea, water in the project space. And we'll begin our next panel in 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.